This government did not listen to the urgent need in seniors' care facilities. The Saskatchewan Health Region, Mr. Speaker, says that it actually needs 450 more care aides, but it simply requested 38 because they knew that resources on this, Mr. Speaker, were extremely limited by this government. They said, Mr. Speaker, they actually need 450. They asked for just 38, Mr. Speaker, but this government still said that they were asking for far too much. The government forced them to slash that very moderate request in half to just 19 additional care aides.
We have significant needs in our education system that this government simply isn't paying attention to. Classrooms are overcrowded and under-resourced. Schools aren't getting the much-needed repairs they need. The government now can't even build and own new schools, instead has an ill-advised scheme to rent private schools.
As a matter of basic fairness and common sense, Sacred Heart Community School needs a gym.
Can the minister confirm today that he won't be forcing a P3 rent-a-school scheme on the families and kids of the Connaught school community?
Farmers in Saskatchewan are increasingly frustrated that the provincial and federal governments are not doing their part to solve the grain transportation crisis. And those farmers cannot understand why this premier is going around saying that the federal agriculture minister, Jerry Ritz, is doing a great job and providing strong leadership. Very few farmers who see their prices falling, their bins full of grain, and their bills piling up would share the Premier's sentiment on that. Mr. Speaker, the farmers are feeling the brunt of a grain transportation crisis that's getting worse, and provincial and federal governments are refusing to do much of anything about it. Mr. Speaker, here are the tangible solutions that the NDP has put forward. First of all, we called for more pressure to be put on the rail companies since last year when the bill was in the House, Mr. Speaker, in the federal House. We have called for joint running rights. We've called for legislative performance standards, including enforceable penalties when railways don't perform, and we're calling for fixes to the flawed Fair Rail Freight Services Act, Mr. Speaker.
Carrie and Darren Anderson are constituents of mine. Carrie has MS and has spent a lot of time as a patient in Royal University Hospital over the last year. Carrie and Darren have major concerns about cleanliness and short staffing at RUH. They use words like disgusting and filthy to describe the condition of the hospital. They do use words like phenomenal to describe the frontline staff, but they say the number of workers is woefully inadequate. And this government needs to start listening. Filthy conditions, overcrowded rooms, bizarre improvised call bell systems, not enough nurses and frontline staff, and patients are bearing the consequences of all of that. In Darren's words, quote, when it becomes unsafe for the patient, they need to start to do something different, end quote. To the minister, what assurance can he give to Carrie and Darren that this government is going to stop making health care worse in this province?
The minister needs to listen to what the nurses are saying today, what nurses are saying as their concerns are related to patient safety. A few months ago, we heard from Tracy Zambori, the president of SUN, as the minister referenced. She said that staffing levels are, quote, dangerously low, and that nurses are, quote, very fearful for patient safety, end quote. Those are her words. Our province's nurses, Mr. Speaker, say those concerns about patient safety have still not been addressed.
This is the government that was the first government in all of Canada to actually fail an audit on its central books, Mr. Speaker. It claimed that there was a razor-thin $60 million surplus, but the auditor exposed the truth, and the truth is that the government had a $600 million deficit.
Mr. Speaker, we know that this government is the first government in Canadian history to fail an audit on its GRF books. Remember, Mr. Speaker, that they actually claimed that they ran a $60 million surplus only to be exposed by the provincial auditor that they had run a deficit of $600 million. So there's no question that this government doesn't know how to manage its provincial finances, Mr. Speaker. But Saskatchewan families are growing increasingly frustrated that they have to keep paying extra to make up for that government's shortcomings.
And, whether you're Northern Saskatchewan, rural Saskatchewan, whether you live in the urban centres, there are challenges when you look at the cost of utilities, when you look at the cost of just trying to survive and take care of their families.
Mr. Speaker, producers are frustrated with the federal agricultural minister for being asleep at the switch and for failing to take meaningful action to fix the backlog that we are seeing. I think it's about time, in fact, that the provincial government and the federal government actually begin to take this issue seriously.
New Democrats are standing with producers and calling for joint running rights. To the Minister, why is this government siding with CN and CP against the interests of farmers?
The way that they've approached the questions of privatization, it's always that struggle. They can't wait to privatize things, but they know that it's not acceptable to the broader public. So what do? We see these piecemeal privatizations.
This approach of outsourcing opportunity, such as what we see with Texas plates all over our province on SaskPower and Sask Energy vehicles, exporting those profits far outside Saskatchewan and not providing that quality employment that those crowns should in our province is something that's troubling.
That the government enters into an agreement through SaskPower with Northland Power in North Battleford, and they won't tell us how much it costs. We don't know how much it costs. Well, that is a major decision being made by a Crown corporation to privatize, to sell off a chunk.
Tennessee license boondoggle that they had, and I mean, they may be proud of it. It sounds like the minister thinks it was the greatest thing since sliced bread to bring the Tennesseans up to sell the fishing licenses. He really likes that idea.
This government chose to privatize the parks registration system and hand control to an Ontario company. This year's much-anticipated provincial park registration opened up on Monday, and as of yesterday, at least 1,500 Saskatchewan people had already been overcharged because of a malfunction in the system.
Speaker, that government has had 7 long years to figure out how to be the government, Mr. Speaker. But it can't even answer basic questions about the contracts it signs with the road builders. And that's completely unacceptable.
Mr. Speaker, this government doesn't seem to have its facts together regarding either the budget or the timing of its carbon capture project. It's really not surprising that this government considers a project that's $120 million over budget to be on budget. After all, it's the same government that failed an audit for trying to pretend that a $600 million deficit it was running was actually a $60 million surplus. SaskPower has admitted this project is over budget. The Minister of the Economy has admitted this project is over budget. So Saskatchewan people cannot understand why it is that the Premier keeps saying that the $120 million of cost overruns are somehow on budget. To the Minister, what kind of accounting practices is the government using to claim a project that's $120 million over budget is actually on budget?
They're the government. They're responsible for the decisions they've made. They've had 7 years, and they've made the decisions.
The inquest into the deaths of 3 seniors at St. Mary's Villa in 2010 heard concerning testimony yesterday. The boiler that caused the deadly carbon monoxide poisoning was on the health region's needed capital repairs, but there simply were not enough funds, Mr. Speaker, provided to get the job done. There's a crucial lesson here for this government. When you force health regions to make difficult decisions about urgent projects to focus on, the consequences can be tragic. My question for the Premier, Mr. Speaker, in light of what we heard yesterday about the government forcing health regions to scale back their urgent requests, how can he guarantee that there are no urgently needed repairs that are being ignored, like the boiler at St. Mary's Villa?
Hear, hear.
If the minister actually read through the 250 pages of urgent requests from the health regions, he would know that the reality for seniors in care facilities does not match his rhetoric. The standard of care is uneven and inadequate. Later today, I will introduce legislation that will establish a residents in care Bill of Rights and require the government to regulate province-wide minimum care standards.
So the government's excuse for scrapping the minimum care standards was that it was out of date and didn't speak to the present reality. But the reality for seniors who are in care, Mr. Speaker, is that the current amount of care they receive hardly exceeds that 2-hour minimum requirement that was there. So instead of scrapping the minimum requirement, Mr. Speaker, this government should have strengthened it. My question to the Premier, will this government realize that strong, province-wide minimum care standards are absolutely essential here in Saskatchewan?
Hear, hear. I recognize the member from Saskatoon Riversdale.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I move that Bill number 606, the Residents in Care Bill of Rights Act 2014, be now introduced and read a first time.
Hear, hear.
It has been moved by the member from Riversdale.